let me get started then. I'm going to get the sources on the screen. I know how to do it. I click that share, and then what? Application. Voila. Okay. What it says in the Gemara is Amar uh, Amar Rav Shmuel, Rav Bar Shmuel said in the name of Rav Chia. Now remember that we're talking about the opinion of Rav Bar Shmuel, because in a few lines it's going to be important to remember who's talking here. This opinion originates from Rav Bar Shmuel. He says, Ein habotzea rashai livtzoa. Whoever is going to cut the bread to eat the bread is not allowed to do so. You're not allowed to cut the bread in order to eat a slice of bread. Ad sheyaviu melach, unless they bring salt. You can't cut a slice of bread to eat it until you have salt on the table. Liftan, or something else you're going to eat the bread with. Back in those days, all the bread was like pita, and people would eat stuff with the pita, like you eat hummus with pita nowadays. So that's the liftan, the other stuff that you eat with the bread. Now we make sandwiches. You put butter, or if you're more health conscious, you put something else healthy on the bread. Maybe butter is healthy. What do I know? But whatever you smear on the bread, that's what you eat together with the bread. According to Rav Bar Shmuel, you don't cut the bread. You don't cut a slice until you've got salt, or the other stuff you're going to eat with the bread has to be lifnei kol echad ve'echad. Everyone has to have this on the table before you cut the bread, which is obviously not even ready to make a hamotzie yet. You washed your hands, you're getting ready to slice the bread, and then you will make hamotzie. Well, meanwhile, if there's no salt or liftan on the table, someone has to bring it. Now, the same Rav Bar Shmuel, the same guy who just taught us this halacha, Ikla Lebei Reish Galusa, came for a visit to the house of the Reish Galusa. The Reish Galusa was the Rav. He was the rabbi who was in charge of the whole Babylonian Jewish community. He was the Rav Rashi of all of Babylonia back in the days of the Talmud Bavli. So Rav Bar Shmuel is coming for a visit to the Rav Harashi. Afikule Rifta. They brought Rav Bar Shmuel some bread to eat. Botzelahedya. He cut the bread right away, didn't wait for salt to come, didn't wait for anything else. They brought him the bread and he cut it right away and made a bracha, Hamotzie lechem min haaretz, and he washed his hands first, of course. Amruleh, they said to him, V'chi hadama mishmaisei? Have you retracted your earlier opinion? We all know that you're the one who taught us that you're not allowed to cut the bread until you have salt or liftan on the table, salt or something else to eat the bread with. And now you didn't wait for anything else to come. Have you changed your mind? Have you retracted your opinion? The word hadar means to return, literally means to return, that is to retract your previous opinion. Amalahu, he said to them, no, I've not retracted my opinion. I have the same opinion I always had. Let din sarich boshesh. There's no need to wait in this case. That's the Gemara. Let's understand what we have, and then we'll explain what the Gemara means. First, Rav Bar Shmuel says you shouldn't cut the bread. You shouldn't cut a slice from the bread and make hamotzie until you have salt on the table, or cheese or whatever it is you're going to eat with the bread. Then there's a story in the book. Rav Bar Shmuel, the same rabbi, comes to the house of the Rav Harashi, the Reish Galusa in Bovel, and they serve him bread, and he doesn't wait. He just slices a piece and makes a hamotzie and eats it. And they ask him, did you retract your opinion? Do you no longer hold that you have to wait for the salt to come to the table, or the cheese, or whatever it is you're eating with the bread? And he said, apparently, no, 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 there's no need to wait. Rashi explains the reason he didn't wait. Pat Nikiya hizo. The Reish Galusa, the Rav Harashi of Bavel, was very wealthy. He had clean bread. Well, that's what we would call white bread. You, like me, might not be a fan of white bread. Well, I eat it sometimes, good, you, like me, might prefer what they called patlonikia, bread with the subin, with the fibers in it, whole wheat bread. So normally he was accustomed to eating whole wheat bread, and that's the situation where he needed salt or something to eat the bread with. When he visited the Reish Galusa, the Rav Harashi of Bavel, who was very wealthy, and served him white bread, pat nikia, that's clean, and therefore no need for salt or anything else. You can eat it by itself. That's the Gemara. Now, let's understand how this is formulated by the poskim, how it becomes halacha. Here's a text from the Shulchan Aruch. Lo yivtza, you shouldn't cut a slice from the bread to eat it. You did netilas yadayim, you're getting ready to make hamotzie. You shouldn't slice the bread before hamotzie. Ad sheyaviu lefanav melech o liftan, until they bring salt to the table or something else that you're going to eat, hummus or whatever you're going to eat bread with. Well, just word for word, a quotation of Rav Bar Shmuel in the Gemara. Ve'im hi nikia, if the bread is white, pure, clean, nothing else in it but the white flour. Oh, shehi mitubelet betavlin, or if you make the bread with spices in it, with flavors in it, or b'melach, or if you put melach, you put salt in the recipe. Back in those days, salt was not a typical ingredient in the recipe for making bread. Nowadays, I never heard of a recipe for making bread that doesn't have salt in it, except for people who are on low salt diets. But nowadays, every typical recipe for bread has salt in it. That was not true in those days. In the days of the Shulchan Aruch, if you were putting salt in the recipe for the bread, no need to bring salt to the table. You've already got it in the bread. Nowadays, that means that commercial bread or homemade bread, aside from the cases of people who are very strict because they're on low sugar, on low salt diets, bread always has, except matzah. Matzah for Pesach, you're not allowed to put salt in matzah for Pesach. Matzah for Pesach is only flour and water and nothing, absolutely nothing else. So nowadays, the idea of eating pat, bread, without salt in it, for most people who are not on salt-free diets, the problem only comes up with matzah. On the other hand, the matzah, the commercial matzah that we have today, and indeed homemade matzah, I know my son makes homemade matzah every year. It's a family enterprise a few days before Pesach. In any event, the flour which they sell for matzah varies in its quality. The machines which are used for grinding wheat into flour for use on Pesach, they have special tahanot, special grinding machines, special mills which are used for the purpose, and the machinery which is used is very in most mills. It's very old machinery. Gets used only for Pesach, and it's old machinery and not so good in separating the wheat from the chaff. Therefore, in much of the flour which is made for matzahs, you have a lot of the good whole wheat stuff in it. It's really not as white flour is normally thought of nowadays. On the other hand, the other mills, which do have more modern machinery, and they produce really pure white flour. So if you're interested in more whole in flour, which is more in the direction of whole wheat for Pesach, it is available in the market. Bake your own matzahs if you want, but the pure white is also available. Therefore, matzah surely has no salt in it, and therefore, according to the Shulchan Aruch, you need salt on the table, unless the pot is nikia, unless it's made from pure white flour. And there is such available on the market. Ke'ein shalanu, nowadays, the Shulchan Aruch writes this back at the beginning of the 15th century in Eretz Yisrael. Nowadays, we are already adding salt to the recipe. If your intention is to eat bread with nothing else, um, um, your intention is not to have any salt. Nowadays, this would apply to people who are on salt-free diets. Back in those days, there were people who ate pat hareva, bread by itself with nothing else, as not exactly, they weren't fasting, but it was a way of limiting, a way of limiting their pleasure in eating. Asceticism, preacher, mehana, was a big thing in pre-Hasidic days. For example, in the days of the Shulchan Aruch in the early 15th century, and there were a lot of people who practiced asceticism or prisha, mehana'a, and they ate only bread with bread and water. That's what they ate. So if your intention is to avoid salt, which in those days meant you wanted to be an ascetic, or nowadays it would mean that your doctor told you you're not allowed to have any salt. Well, if you're not going to have any salt anyway, so you don't need the salt for the bread. Einot tzarich lahamtin, you don't have to wait for salt. Now, let me point out that salt is also required for salting meat in order to get out the blood. We're not going to discuss the details of how to do that, but everyone knows that koshering meat requires salt. Now, the question arises, what about someone who is on a salt-free diet? What is he or she supposed to do to make the bread kosher, to make the meat kosher? As far as this is concerned, the poskim are agreed that salt substitutes, people who don't take salt for health reasons can buy in a health food store salt substitutes instead of sodium chloride, that's the molecule of salt. You can buy potassium chloride in health food stores, which tastes sort of like salt. You won't be fooled. It isn't as good as real salt, but it has somewhat of the salty taste, and it's with potassium and not with sodium. And therefore, from the health point of view, for people who are not allowed to have salt, it's the sodium that they're not allowed to have. And therefore, the poskim agreed that if you have a health objection to salting meat to make it kosher, you can kosher the meat with one of the salt substitutes. For example, what they sell nowadays is potassium chloride. You can buy it in any health food store. Similarly, the same conclusion would then be applied to bread. If you have a health problem and therefore do not want to swallow any sodium chloride, regular salt, then the salt substitutes, which are sold in the market, typically potassium chloride, that's okay for eating bread as well. What have we learned up till this point? If the bread is made of pure white flour, no need for salt or anything else. If the bread has already salt or tavlin, spices in the dough, no need for any additional salt. If you are practicing asceticism and all you're going to eat is bread and water, or for health reasons, you're not going to eat any salt at all, then no need for salt when you make hamotzie. That's what we've learned up till now. The Ramah, the Ashkenaz posek adds, Makom Makom, in any event, mitzvah lahaniach al kol shulchan melech kodem sheyivsa. Nonetheless, even if you're not going to eat the salt, even if you're not going to use it at all, maybe because there's already salt in the recipe, or maybe because you don't want the pleasure of salted food, or maybe because you have a health issue, whatever the reason is, even if you're not going to eat the salt, it should at least be on the table. Why should it be on the table? Ki hashulchan domeh lemizbeach. The table upon which we eat is compared to the mizbeach, the altar in the Beis Hamikdash. Achila kekorban, and our eating is parallel. Our eating corresponds with what the Kohanim did when they ate the korbanot. That's what it says in the pasuk. Al kol korbancha takriv melach. Every korban in the Beis Hamikdash required melach, required salt. Therefore, since the table is like the mizbeach, and since the eating of the food is like the korban, therefore you need salt on the table, even if you're not going to eat it. The now would be the time to, if this were not a halachic discussion, now would be the time to talk about eating the meal being an important element in kapara, tshuva, and atonement, just as the whole purpose of the korbanot was tshuva and atonement. Eating can fulfill that function if you have the thoughts of kedusha, if you keep in mind the elements of kedusha and make the proper brachot and eat in the proper way. Well, this also will contribute to tshuva and kapara. Well, if this were not a halachic discussion, that's the direction we would go now. Umegein mipnei poranios, having salt on the table will protect you from bad things happening, just as the avoda in the Beis Hamikdash protected Am Yisrael from having bad things happen to them. Well, your table, if it is set up correctly, and one of the elements is salt on the table to remind you that the table is like the Mizbeach, like the Mizbeach in the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore you should keep in mind the kedusha of eating, and that will move you along in the path of tshuva and kapara. Well, that too will protect you from bad things happening. So we see that the salt has two elements to it. Element number one, it's part of the proper eating of bread. If there's already salt in the recipe, or if for whatever reason you're not going to consume any salt at all, so you don't need it. But there's a second element, another reason for having salt, and that is the comparison of the table to the Mizbeach in the Beis Hamikdash. And as far as that's concerned, all you need is salt on the table. You don't actually have to eat it, but you need the salt on the table for the comparison with the Mizbeach. Now let's see what the Mishnah Brura has to say about all of this. These are the words of Mishnah Berurah. The Shulchan Aruch says, quoting Rav in the Gemara, melach, salt, or liftan, hummus, or whatever you're eating with the bread. You have a choice. You don't need melach. Whatever you're eating to make the bread more of a meal. The bread should have good taste when you eat it. Mishum kvod habracha, that's the way of honoring the bracha. When you make the bracha, of course you want to honor the bracha, Hamotzie lechem min haaretz, and there are many ways in which you can honor the bracha, many ways in which you should honor the bracha. If you're making a bracha on any food, grapes, I don't care what it is, the first grape that you eat when you make the bracha should be a very nice one, a big one, a nice one. That's a way of honoring the bracha. And what does honor mean? What does kavod mean? B'chol haTorah kula, throughout the length and breadth of Torah, kavod, honor means tzumet alev, nitinat hada'at, focusing your attention. Focusing your attention on someone is the way of honoring that person. How does one honor one's parents? By focusing your attention on the parents' needs and fulfilling the parents' needs. But you have to pay attention to what the parents need. How do you honor the Rav? By paying attention to what the Rav says, by being attentive. Kavod, throughout the length and breadth of Torah, is an element of tzumet alev, nitinat hadat, focusing your attention. And therefore, when you make a bracha, whether it's Hamotzie lechem min haaretz or any other bracha, you should do what you can to focus your mind and have good kavanah when you recite the bracha. One way to do that is to what you're holding in your hand, ready to put into your mouth and eat, is something good, is something which you will enjoy. That's why you need the melach or the liftan. Mishnah Berurah also goes on and says, if you want to practice asceticism and you want to deprive yourself of pleasures in this world, which, as I said, was quite common before the Hasidic movement, ein bazeh mishum kvod habracha ho'il de'ein ta'ato lecho klal b'sudas o melech hatachli. If you've decided that you're not going to eat anything which gives you more pleasure in the meal, you're going to only have bread and water because you want to minimize your pleasure in this world. Well, if you've decided that you're not going to eat any melach, then you don't need it for the bracha either. When the Ramah says that the table we eat on is like the mizbeach, like the altar in the Beis Hamikdash, K'moshe Amru Chazal, this is what the Gemara teaches us. Bizman sheBeis Hamikdash Kayam. Back in the days when the Beis Hamikdash was standing, Hamizbeach mechaper al Adam. You were able to do tshuva and get kapara by offering a korban. Achshav, nowadays, shulchano shel adam, shenoten melachmo ledal mechaper alav. Nowadays, your table where you eat will grant you tshuva and kapara. How does that work? What's so great about your table? Because you give some of your food to poor people. You don't have to literally take the food from your table and give that to the poor people, but that you are supporting poor people and enabling poor people to eat. That is what is moving you along the path of tshuva. That is what is granting you kapara. The verse in the Navi says, V'yadaber elai zeh hashulchan asher lifnei Hashem. The shulchan that we eat upon is a shulchan in the of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, just like the Mizbeach in the Beis HaMikdash was. Well, so what have we learned? We've learned that you need the salt in the situations where it's going to improve your enjoyment from the bread, and you could equally use liftan, hummus, or whatever it is you want to eat with the bread, cheese, or whatever, is all the same. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is, of course, Ashkenazi. What about the other team? What about the Sephardic rabbis? The Kaf HaChaim is a sefer which occupies a position in Sephardic communities very similar to the Mishnah Berurah in Ashkenaz communities. He says, Hashulchan hu hamizbeach. The table that we eat upon is like the altar. Mitam zeh mechasim hasakinim. This is why we cover the knives when we come to Birkat Hamazon. Come to Birkat Hamazon, any knives on the table, the great Sephardic authority, the Kaf HaChaim says, cover the knives. It's a verse. Ki harbacha heinafta alea t'chalea. If you use a knife to cut the stones for the Mizbeach is pasul, invalid. The stones of the Mizbeach, the stones of the altar, had to be made without any iron implements. Why? Well, we'll see the reason in a moment. Ode, furthermore, nira li deyesh li zaher bazeh shelo laharog kina. Therefore, it seems to me that since the table is like the Mizbeach, and since the Mizbeach in the Beis HaMikdash, you're not allowed to use any iron, any metal implements, and that's why we cover the knives. Similarly, you should not kill a louse, which you find on the table. You find an insect on the table, you don't kill it on the table. And all this applies not only to the table you're eating on, but the table that you're learning Torah on, which is maybe the same table. The kiyah lavdafka. And not only should you avoid killing lice that might be on your table, aluadin, parosh, any kind of bug, any kind of insect, you shouldn't kill on the table because the table is like the Mizbeach. All of this comes, all of this comes to sharpen your attention and make you aware that the table is like the Mizbeach and therefore so important for tshuva and kapara. Now let's understand a little bit more about the knife. The Taz, one of the two principal commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, points out, Yesh osrim lekanes lebeit haKnesset b'sakin haroch. There are two kinds of knives, short knives and long knives. Long knives, that's what we call a sword. A long knife is a sword. That's used for fighting and for killing people. Short knives, well, could be a dagger, could be used for fighting and killing people, but short knives we could also use for cutting up food and for eating, also have kosher uses. Why are you not allowed to bring a long knife? That's why. Is it prohibited to bring a sword in the synagogue? Lefisha tefillah marechet yemav shel adam. Tefillah, davening in the Beis HaKnesset, davening in the shul is intended to lengthen your life. Sakin mekatzeret, and the long knife, the sword, shortens life. That's why you have swords, to shorten people's lives. Therefore, swords contradict the whole purpose of tefillah, and therefore you shouldn't have a sword in the synagogue. Further, nahagu lechasot hasakin bebirkat hamazon. Further, and now we have an Ashkenaz source about the minhag of covering knives during birkat hamazon. Lefishu mikatzer chayim, since knives can be used as daggers to kill people, they shorten lives. The shulchan ma'arich yemei adam, the table, which is like the mizbeach, is intended to increase your number of days upon the earth, to lengthen your life. Eino din she'anif mikatzer alamarich, and therefore it's wrong to have that which shortens life, a knife, on that which lengthens life, the table, parallel to the mizbeach. Nearly diyesh lechalek ben sakin aroch v'sakin katzar. But there's a difference in concept between long knives, that means swords, and short knives when it comes to birkat hamazon. Bazeh yesh efsharut lechasot kol sakin katzar. It's simple enough to cover short knives on the table. That's simple enough. You have a short knife on the table, simple enough to cover it. Amailo navid hacha. Since it's so simple to do, why not be machmir? Why not knife, since it's so simple to do? Aval bebeit knesset, but in the synagogue, nitztarech l'salek mimenu asakin legamrei. In the Beit Knesset, we have to leave the knife outside of the synagogue. That means the sword. We have to leave the sword outside of the synagogue. So tircha yisera, that's putting a great burden on the person carrying the sword to leave it outside the synagogue and trust that it will still be there when he or she, well, women wouldn't use swords, I'm sure, whether when he leaves the synagogue, he has to trust that it's still going to be there. So litlo, go back and hope it's still there so he can pick it up again. Gam lif'amim yesh bo tzorach b'oto pam. As far as small knives are concerned, you might have some legitimate use for it in the synagogue. Al-Kaid lo hitrichu, therefore they did not place upon us the burden of removing knives before going into the synagogue, aside from swords. So the Taz is machalik. The Taz distinguishes between swords and short knives as far as the synagogue is concerned, where it's somewhat burdensome to leave your knives, you leave your sword outside of the synagogue, you have to trust that it will still be there when you return. Chazal were insisting only on leaving the swords outside. And the short knives, you might have some legitimate use for. In the synagogue, you might want to cut up some vegetable or something to eat it. But on the table where you eat, you're obviously not going to have any swords on the table. If you do, you should remove them from the table. And short knives are so easy to cover, no burden there, so you should do it. Now, you remember the Shulchan Aruch taught us that just as the Mizbeach protects the Jewish people from bad things happening, Puraniot, similarly, the table you eat on, if you eat in a kosher way, the table will protect you from bad things happening, Puraniot, who Megin, the table protects you. Katav B'Beit Yosef. Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote in the name of the Tosafot, who in turn was quoting a midrash, Kishi Yisrael Yoshvim Umamtinin Ze al Ze, when the Jews are sitting around the table, waiting for the company to assemble so they can begin the meal. Here we're just sitting around the table waiting for the company to arrive so we can begin the meal. Ad sheyitlu yadehem, we're just waiting around. So it'll be time to wash the hands and start the meal. And below mitzvahs. They're just sitting around, wasting time, not doing any mitzvot. Wow. If the Jews are just sitting around, waiting for the company to assemble so they can begin the meal. They're not doing any mitzvot. And if they're not doing any mitzvot, Hasatan mikatreg aleim. Satan is going to prosecute them. Brit melach megin alehem. And therefore, having salt on the table, remembering the Brit melach that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made with Am Yisrael, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will protect us, that is important to have on the table. It's, of course, not the salt that protects you, nothing magical about salt, but the salt will remind you of the Brit Melach, the covenant between Am Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and holding that covenant between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Am Yisrael in mind, that will protect you. Tov l'daber b'divrei Torah m'lo bottle. Of course, instead of just sitting around doing nothing, waiting for the company to assemble, so you can begin the meal. Of course, if you have nothing to do, what you should do is talk about the divrei Torah. Then you won't be in danger of having the Satan prosecute you. Speak divrei Torah. V'tov mishneihem shelo lafsi klal, and the best, of course, would be not to be stuck in this situation of waiting for the people to assemble. People should be punctual. People should be punctual. If the wedding feast is supposed to begin at 8:30, the Magen Avraham says it should begin at 8:30 and not 9:30 or 10 o'clock. According to the Magen Avraham, people should be punctual. And why is it important to be punctual when the company is assembling for a meal, whether it's a wedding feast or anything else? Why should the people be punctual? Because if you're not, some of the company is going to be just sitting around waiting, wasting time until the other stragglers arrive and you can begin the meal. And while wasting time, they will be subject to the kitrug, to the prosecution of the Satan, and that we don't want. Now, this idea in the Magen Avraham emphasizing the importance of punctuality in community meals, communal meals, is based on an idea in the Tosafot. These are the words of the Tosafot. Rabbi Menachem hayam medaktek ma'od lavi melech al shulchan k'de'isa b'midrash. Rabbi Menachem, one of the great rabbis from the High Middle Ages, was very, very strict to always have salt on the table. Why? Because it says in the Midrash, when the Jews are sitting around just waiting for the company to assemble, and below mitzvahs, they're not engaged in any mitzvahs at the moment, the Satan will prosecute them, brit melach megin alehem. Having the salt on the table will remind you of the covenant with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that memory, focusing your attention, focusing your mind on the covenant, that will save you from puraniot, that will save you from bad things happening. Magen Avraham goes on and says, Af alpi de'einanu nohagim ba'achilas melach mishum diyesh pat melach. Even though nowadays, he wrote this in the 17th century, even though nowadays we all put salt in the dough, we all put salt in the recipe where we're making bread, nonetheless, it's a mitzvah to have salt on the table to remind us that it's like this, to remind us of the covenant with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Katvu mekubalim l'tabel prusas habitzia b'melach, and the mekubalim al pi Kabbalah teach us that it's important to dip the bread in the salt, not to sprinkle the salt on the bread, but to dip the bread in the salt. As we've mentioned in the past, Magen Avraham, 17th century Poland, was the first of the great poskim to systematically refer to Kabbalistic ideas in his halachic commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. And here, as is so typical of him, he brings the Kabbalistic aspect into the halachic discussion, Kabbalistic reasons why the bread should be dipped into the salt rather than sprinkling the salt on the bread. As far as the halacha is concerned, Magen Avram himself has just made clear that what you need is salt on the table. You don't actually have to use it. It's there to remind you of the covenant. But according to the Mikubalim, the salt should be eaten with the bread by dipping. The Ber Hetev quotes the Arizal, Al derech hanistar tzarich melach afilu patnik naki. For mystical reasons, you should always have salt with the bread. And that's also in the Beit Yaakov, the Mikubalim emphasize the importance of dipping the bread 3 times into the salt. So if you want to tread the mystical path, if you want to embrace the concepts of Kabbalah, then even though you consume the salt, as far as the halacha is concerned, it's sufficient to have it on the table because our bread, aside from matzah, aside from recipes for salt-free diets, since our bread has salt in it, you don't actually have to add any salt when you make hamotzie. It's enough to have it on the table, but the Mikubalim insist on dipping the bread 3 times in the salt. Mikubalim here have added three issues. The following are the 3 Kabbalistic issues as far as salt are concerned. 1, it's not enough to have salt on the table, but you should dip the bread in the salt. Number 2, not just 1 dip, but 3 dips of bread into the salt. The third item which the Mekubalim add in addition to the halachic requirements, Tzarich lidbol et apat belechem v'lo ipcha, the bread should be dipped in the salt and not having the salt sprinkled on the bread. Halacha, of course, is important for all Jews everywhere. Those among us who wish to follow the Kabbalistic path now know the foundations of the Kabbalistic principles regarding Hamotzie. But that's not required for everyone. That's for people who choose to follow the Kabbalistic path in addition to Halacha. Mayor Poppers. Rav Meir Poppers, we speak over and over again about the writings of the Arizal. The truth is, we don't have any writings from the Arizal. Everything that we call the writings of the Arizal, whole shelf full of svarim, it's all the Talmidim who wrote down what they heard in the shiurim of the Arizal. And those manuscripts circulated for many years until Rav Meir Poppers gathered together the most important manuscripts of the notes written by the Talmidim, the disciples of the Arizal, and it was Rav Meir Poppers who edited them and printed the first editions of all of the writings of the Arizal as we have from the Talmidim. So Rav Meir Poppers is one of the most important names in the Kabbalistic tradition. He's the one who edited and printed the first editions of all of the works of the Arizal, and what he did remains until today the standard, the absolute standard in the field. He says, "Nachon liot zahir v'zariz litein melech ala shulchan." You have to be careful to make sure that there's salt on the table so that you will be able to dip the bread 3 times in the salt. V'yina'er b'chol pa'am. Every time you dip, you should shake the bread a little bit so you don't have a lot of salt remaining on the bread. U'al pisod, this is a mystical reason, a mystical principle. Ki melach hu midas adin. Melach, salt, has to do with salt, refers to divine judgment. Lechem, bread, refers to rachamim, divine mercy. These are 2 contradictory ideas. There is divine judgment, represented by the salt, which is harsh. There's divine rachamim, mercy, represented by the bread, which is the opposite of harsh. That's merciful. Therefore, Yitbol Hamotzie b'melach kedei sheyigbar midas harachamim al midas hadin. Therefore, we dip the bread into the salt in order that midas harachamim, in order that divine mercy should prevail over divine justice. Ki hamelech lamata v'lechem lamala, the salt should be on the bottom, the bread should be on the top, so that the bread supersedes, so that the bread prevails over the salt, so that divine mercy should prevail over divine judgment. That is the foundation of the Kabbalistic idea of dipping the bread in the salt. Yad Aharon, commentary written by one of the great Sephardic authorities. Bizman Talmud, back in Talmudic days, Kol Echad Haya Ochel B'Shulchan Katan Lefanav. Everyone had their own small table that they used to eat from. Like in Leil HaSeder, the Haggadah of Pesach always talks about bringing the table in, bringing the table out. They had little tables. They sat on the ground, or in some societies they sat on chairs, and little tables would be brought, and the people would eat on tables in and out, back and forth from the kitchen. This is true, incidentally, in Europe as well, until the beginning, mid 17th century. Towards the middle of the 17th century, architects in Europe began adding an extra room to wealthy houses. Most people lived in one-room houses, but wealthy people had more than one room in their house. And beginning around the middle of the 17th century, architects began adding a dining room into the houses of wealthy people. Prior to the middle of the 17th century, there was no such thing as a dining room. You ate in whatever room, well, if you're in one-room house, but if you're wealthy and you had many rooms, you would eat in whatever room you happened to be in, sitting in a chair or on the floor, depending on which culture you're in, and the food would be brought to you on little tables, which were easily mobile. That's the way they ate in the days of the Gemara. That was historically true until the middle of the 17th century, when dining rooms first came into use, at least in wealthy homes. Mishum hachi, because of this, amru shetzarich melach lifnei kol echad v'echad. This is why the Shulchan Aruch, early 15th century, this is why the Shulchan Aruch says you have to have salt in front of each person who is eating, because each person who is eating had his or her own little table. And depending upon the culture, they were either sitting on the floor or sitting on chairs. Well, bismanenu, nowadays, in the 18th century, nowadays we all eat at one table. And of course, he's talking about those societies where they're not sitting on the floor and sitting around the food. They're sitting on chairs around the table. Nowadays, we have dining room tables. Lifnei botzera dai, and therefore it's enough to have one salt on the table for everyone. You don't need everyone to have their own individual salt, like the Shulchan Aruch said. Although the Shulchan Aruch does indeed say everyone needs salt in front of him or her, the Torah dropped this because if everyone is eating at one table, then you no longer need salt in front of everyone. Let's look at the modern, contemporary tshuvas. Tshuvot v'hanhagot, written by Rav Moshe Sternbuch, originally from London. spent some time in South Africa. He was a Rav in South Africa. Today he lives in Harnof, I believe. He's the head of one of the heads of the Eda Haredit in Mea Sha'arim. Azkir kan halacha mitzuya b'b'tzias spas. Let me mention a halacha, which most people don't fulfill. I know, namely, tzarich le'achol prusat hamotzie im melach u'lehosif ba gam tavlin. The bread, the slice of bread that you eat after making a motzi needs salt or spices or something additional to make it tasty. What additional can you add to the bread to make it tasty? Gvina, salat, fish, anything which will make the bread more tasty. Why? Shapat levad lo ta'im. Everyone knows that bread by itself is not tasty. Well, you might disagree. I surely disagree. Uh, I bake bread and not rarely buy bread in the bakery, and good bread is good bread. I find it very tasty, but he didn't. He thought that just ordinary bread by itself is not very palatable. And says in the Gemara, Ein levarech motzi ella im melech uliftan. The reason that we have to have melach or spices or cheese or fish or something with the bread is to make it more tasty. Al kain, al pisod, you have to dip 3 times according to the Mekubalim. Me'ikar adin, what is fundamentally required by halacha is that the bread be tasty when you make the bracha. Nowadays, the amount of salt in the bread, he says, is imperceptible. He knows that his wife puts salt in the bread when she bakes it. He knows that all the commercial bread has salt in it, but he doesn't taste it. I don't know why not. Uh, but he doesn't. He says it doesn't taste salty enough for him. Tavli nadi, if it's better to use some kind of spices or something else to make the bread tasty. Therefore, mitzvah yom nowadays every Suda you need something to eat the bread with to make it tasty. Um, now, you might or might not agree with his underlying assumptions. As you know, I don't agree with the underlying assumptions. His underlying assumption is that bread by itself doesn't taste so good. And therefore, in honor of the bracha, you have to eat the bread with something which is going to make it taste good. And he says this is clear in the Shulchan Aruch HaRav. If you read the text of the Balatanya, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, he says, Tzarich lehat'im ha'prusa melech. You have to do something to make the bread delicious. Lehat'im. You have to do something to make the bread tasty so that it will be eaten with pleasure when you make the bracha. Well, you have to decide for yourself whether you think the bread which you have baked or which you've bought, you have to decide yourself whether you think the bread is tasty by itself. If you think so, then you don't have to be concerned with all of this. But if you do not find the bread tasty, which you have baked or which you have bought, then you really should, when you make the bracha, you really should eat the bread together with something else so it will be tasty. One final note about the Chatam Sofer. This business of salt on the table, he embraced the idea strongly, and he encouraged everyone to have salt on the table with one exception. Leil Shabbos, Friday night meal. Leil Shabbos, Friday night meal, he didn't bother with salt on the table. No need. The Chatam Sofer said in every meal you should have salt on the table because the table is like the Mizbeach, except on Friday night. What's the difference between Friday night? Why do you need Friday night? Because al kol korbanecha takrif melach, you had to have salt on the mizbeach every time you would bring a korban. And on Friday nights, on Leil Shabbos, there were no korbanot. And since there were no korbanot offered on the mizbeach on Leil Shabbos, Friday night, it follows, Mamela, it follows that they did not need salt on the mizbeach Friday night. Well, if they did not have salt on the Mizbeach Friday night, then you do not need salt on your table Friday night, the Chatam Sofer, although he in general insisted on salt, not on Friday night. Um, uh, the same Chuvot V'Hanagot that we saw earlier has another tshuva which is very similar to the one we already saw, in which he once again emphasizes the importance of eating something together with the bread when you make the bracha, so that the bread will be more tasty. And with this, I'm going to pause and wish you a good week and a safe week, and eventually a good Shabbos, and ask you if you have any questions that you would like to pose at this time. Oh, now I get to see you, Dick. Shalom. Oh, the smile. Good, 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 good. Your smile lights up the day. But I don't hear you. Now I can, before I could hear you sort of, but couldn't see you. Now I can see you, but I don't hear you. No. Okay. Good wishes to you as well. Be well. My lip reading is weak. I can't figure it out. Oh, now she disappeared. Oh, shalom, shalom.